The Last of Us is a special game. There's nothing that we or anyone else can say about it that hasn't already been said before. A thrilling journey wrought with emotion and adrenaline. An engaging story of two deeply flawed yet incredibly sympathetic characters. A visual and technical masterpiece that showcases Naughty Dog's writing at its best. These are all things that we've heard before, and you know what? They're all true. The Last of Us is one of those rare games that you praise for its standout storytelling and you actually mean it. Naughty Dog announced a sequel to this seminal adventure not long ago, and while there's no end to our excitement as we wait for it with giddy anticipation, we know that there is, unfortunately, a lot of waiting to be done. The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't even have a release date yet, and expecting it to release anytime before 2019 seems a little unrealistic. So, as we wait for it, maybe we should pause and take a look back at what's already come before. In this 3-part feature, we're going to take a look back at the complete story of The Last of Us, including the events portrayed in the Left Behind DLC, from start to finish, and in as much detail as possible. Considering the nature and style of the narrative of The Last of Us, our focus is going to be first and foremost on the characters, just as it is in the game itself. So while in previous Story So Far features, we've spent a lot of time exploring the lore of franchises such as Mass Effect and Metal Gear Solid, our focus this time is going to be almost completely on the personal journeys of Joel and Ellie. In part 1 of our 3-part recap of The Last of Us, we're going to take a look at Outbreak Day, and the events that take place on that day, and eventually go on to shape the story of the entire game. In addition to that, we'll talk about the aftermath of the cordyceps brain infection pandemic, while also looking at the beginning stages of Joel and Ellie's 1-year-long journey. So without further ado, let's begin. The Last of Us story is centered primarily around a core cast of 2 characters, telling the story of a single year in their lives. But the events that kick off the story themselves take place 20 years before that. It all begins on October 26th of the year 2013, a day that goes on to be known as Outbreak Day. It also happens to be Joel's birthday, one of the 2 main protagonists of the game, and a single father to a young daughter named Sarah. A terrifying disease known as the cordyceps brain infection tears through America and critically hits the masses on this day, causing chaos and destruction in most major cities. What exactly is this disease though? It's described as a fungal infection that attacks the brain and slowly takes over the victim's or host's entire body, turning them into crazed, rabid, mindless, zombie-like freaks. And as the infected start tearing society apart on Outbreak Day, Joel tries to get Sarah to safety. He's helped by his brother Tommy, the 3 of them trying to make it out of Austin as all hell breaks loose around them. After several close calls and being witness to some terrifying things, Joel and Sarah get separated from Tommy. In the confusion, Sarah gets hurt, but Joel picks her up and pushes on, even as they're being chased by the infected. Soon, however, they encounter a soldier. Joel asks him for help, but soon realizes that that's not going to happen. The soldier's commanded by his superiors to take out Joel and Sarah, fearing that they too might be infected. The soldier opens fire, and Joel throws himself and Sarah to the ground as he tries to get out of the way. Tommy arrives at the scene at just the right moment, shooting and killing the soldier. The worst, however, has already happened. Tommy notices that Sarah's been shot, having taken a bullet in the stomach from the soldier, and she's bleeding out. Joel takes her in his arms, and seeing the life slip out of her, he breaks down. Within seconds, in the final moments of the game's harrowing and memorable prologue, Joel's daughter dies in his arms. And that is when The Last of Us story really begins. It's now 20 years later, and the cordyceps brain infection has wrecked human society and civilization as we know it. The towering cityscapes that used to bustle with life and activity are now urban jungles overgrown with wild and newly grown forests, inhabited by all sorts of animals, reclaimed by nature in essence. Most of the population has either died or has fallen victim to the cordyceps brain infection, and they now roam the remnants of the old world as mindless, twisted, and terrifying zombies. Of these infected, there's a few different kinds. There's the more common and also more generic-looking runners. These are humans that are in the relatively early stages of the infection, when the brain and body are still trying and failing to fight the rapid growth of the disease. Runners look more or less like your regular run-of-the-mill zombies, but they're extremely aggressive and surprisingly fast. The real threat, though, at least as far as the infected go, is the clickers. The clickers are what happens once the cordyceps infection fully takes over its host. The fungus grows over all of the brain, and then starts growing outward through the host's eyes and mouth and nose, eventually covering the victim in grotesque spore-like outgrowths. Clickers are also blind, though, so they see through echolocation, which is where they get the name. They make unsettling and weirdly unnerving clicking sounds to see through sound and pinpoint the locations of their victims. Once they hear something, they are frighteningly ferocious, incredibly agile, and a single one of their bites is enough to kill someone. As you can imagine, all of this is important for the story, but what of the people who have somehow managed to survive so far? Well, society as we know it has broken down completely, but a shallow remnant of it still remains. Several small pockets of humans occupy walled-off, heavily defended areas known as quarantine zones, or QZs, all of which are under martial law. There's no government, and while people living within quarantine zones are safe from the outside world and the terrors that now occupy it, they live under oppression and in very dire circumstances, living in fear of both getting infected and military oppression. Even the slightest exposure to the cordyceps fungus can infect a person, at which point the military wastes no time in putting them down. Sure, people often wear gas masks to keep that from happening, but even breathing in a single spore of the fungus can be deadly. Most choose to accept military oppression as the best option available in a terrible situation, choosing to subject themselves to unorganized military rule rather than taking their chances outside the QZs, where raving and roving bands of thugs and bandits would be the least of their worries. Some, however, have chosen to fight against it. The Fireflies are a resistance group of fighters that want an actual government to be reinstated. They're fighting against military control, and for this they've been branded as outlaws. They operate mostly as a guerrilla group and strike from the shadows, disrupting activities in QZs whenever and wherever they can. Among these is the quarantine zone in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where we find an older and more grizzled Joel as the Last of Us story really begins, 20 years after the death of Sarah. And these 20 years have not been kind to Joel, or anyone else for that matter. Since the death of his daughter, Joel has turned into a hardened and embittered man. He has very little moral boundary left to cross, and puts survival above everything else. As it turns out, he isn't even with his brother Tommy anymore. Where exactly he is and what happened between the two of them is a question we'll look into later on. In the Boston quarantine zone, he operates as a smuggler who frequently sneaks out of the zone illegally to trade with other survivors in everything from food to weapons. He doesn't, however, work alone, with Tess being both a professional partner and a friend to him. At the beginning of the game, Tess arrives where Joel lives and tells him that while she was on her way back from completing a deal, she was jumped by two thugs, men who would have killed her if she hadn't killed them first. And it turns out that these thugs were sent by a man named Robert, who operates as the local illegal arms dealer in the Boston QZ. Robert, as it turns out, is in possession of weapons that he'd stolen from Joel and Tess. As such, he knows that they're going to come after him, which is why he wants to take them out first. Tess tells Joel that she knows where Robert is hiding, and the two of them decide to track him down and kill him before he can get to them. But as they're walking through the QZ, they witness an abrupt attack by a group of Fireflies. As combat breaks out between the military and the Fireflies, Joel and Tess manage to get off the street and sneak their way out of the QZ. A significant portion of the game that follows is focused on Joel and Tess making their way past scores of Robert's men. There's stealth and on-the-go crafting, messy yet thrilling gunfights, and brutal hand-to-hand executions. Eventually, after having fought or sleuthed past a number of hurdles, they manage to find Robert. The arms dealer tries to run for it, but Joel and Tess manage to catch him, and Tess all but breaks his legs to stop him from running again. Injured and defenseless, Robert has no option but to answer Joel and Tess's questions. He tells them that he doesn't have their weapons anymore, that he owed them to the Fireflies and thus had to hand them over. Seeing that they have no use for the arms dealer anymore, Tess shoots Robert in the head. She and Joel then decide to look for the Fireflies, but they don't have to go very far. They encounter Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies, a woman both Joel and Tess apparently know very well. Joel, you see, has had run-ins with the Fireflies himself. In the 20 years that followed Outbreak Day, Joel played every role that he had to survive another day, going from bandit to smuggler and everything in between. Joel's brother Tommy, on the other hand, was all about fighting for a cause. He was once a Firefly himself, which is how Joel knows Marlene so well. Of course, Tommy's not a Firefly anymore, and he and Joel haven't seen each other in a while, but that's something we'll talk about in greater detail later on. Marlene now stands before Joel and Tess, with Robert lying dead between them. She tells them that they can have their weapons back, plus some extra weapons from herself, but there's a catch. They have to agree to do a job for her. Smuggle some cargo from inside the QZ to a specific location outside. And what is this cargo exactly? It's a 14-year-old girl named Ellie, the other protagonist of The Last of Us, a fiery and determined young woman. How does she know Marlene though? Why does she need to be smuggled outside? These are all questions that Joel and Tess don't need answers to. To them, this is just another smuggling job, and Ellie is just cargo. Tess goes with Marlene and confirms that she does indeed have the weapons, and so she and Joel agree to do the job. They agree to smuggle Ellie outside the QZ, and give her over to a group of fireflies that'll be waiting for them across the city at the Capitol building, and then collect their payment as soon as they return. And so Joel, Tess, and Ellie set out in the middle of the night, keeping in the shadows and making every attempt to make sure they don't get caught by any of the military's patrols. But as they're about to leave the QZ, that's exactly what happens. The three of them get ambushed by a patrol of 2 soldiers heavily armed and armored. While one of the soldiers calls for backup on his radio, the other subjects Joel, Tess, and Ellie to a scan for the cordyceps infection. He scans both Joel and Tess with the machine, confirms that they're both clean, and just as he's about to move on Ellie, she panics. Ellie stabs the soldier with a switchblade just as he moves in to scan her. Grabbing this opportunity, Joel and Tess both move quickly as well. They make quick work of the 2 soldiers, killing them within seconds. In order to make sure that they can escape before the soldiers' backup arrives, they decide to move on. But before they can do so, they notice something strange. While Ellie did indeed stab the soldier scanning her with a switchblade, the scan had already been completed. Tess and Joel look at the reading on the machine, and they're alarmed to see that it says Ellie is carrying the infection. When pressed for answers by Joel and Tess, Ellie tells them what's really going on. She rolls back her sleeve and reveals that she has a bite from one of the infected on her arm, and that she does indeed have the infection. However, she also claims that the bite is 3 weeks old, which is strange because, as Tess points out, people usually turn within 2 days of being exposed to the cordyceps fungus. Ellie, however, is adamant that her injury is 3 weeks old. Before she can go into greater detail, though, the 3 of them notice a convoy of soldiers in the distance moving in their direction. Deciding that making sure they escape before the backup arrives is more important, they leave the area, and after a section of the game where players try and get past scores of heavily armed soldiers with the help of either stealth, combat, or both, they are able to get away safely. At this point, Ellie explains to Joel and Tess what's going on. She tells them that because of the bite on her arm, Marlene thinks that she's immune to the cordyceps infection, and that whatever is in her blood is the key to a vaccine and in turn humanity's salvation. The Fireflies, she explains, have a bunch of scientists working for them. Scientists who are looking for a cure, and it's these scientists that the group of Fireflies at the Capitol building are supposed to deliver Ellie to. Joel, of course, wants no part of it. He tells Tess that this is not what they signed up for, that they should abandon the job and just go back to the quarantine zone before they run into any trouble. But Tess is able to change his mind. She tells Joel that Ellie is still, for all intents and purposes, just cargo, and that if they're able to deliver her to the Capitol building and make it back, which they should be able to do, then they'll be able to collect the weapons that they're owed. Joel reluctantly agrees, and the 3 of them set out to make it to their destination across the city. The next couple hours of the game are a beautiful mix of quiet, character-building scenes and intense, heart-pumping, edge-of-the-seat moments. Naughty Dog's writing shines once again as the bond between Joel and Tess is portrayed through simple yet effective dialogue, while Ellie's character is also slowly given more shape. As a young girl who was born years after the outbreak, Ellie has never known a world to be anything other than a hollow shell it is now. And what are memories of a normal life to people like Joel and Tess are just fantasies and stories for her. She's been living in the Boston QZ her entire life, and her awe and wonder at the rugged and overgrown beauty of the outside world are perfect illustrations of what it must be like to be a child of the apocalypse. As the 3 of them make their way through a dead city crawling with terrors, they come across several runners and clickers and are involved in countless close calls. More than once, they're almost overwhelmed by large numbers of the infected, but somehow they manage to make it through, and after harrowing trials, Joel, Tess, and Ellie finally make it to the Capitol building, but things don't quite turn out the way they're supposed to. It turns out that the group of Fireflies that was waiting for them had already been slaughtered by somebody, which means that completing the job that Marlene hired Joel and Tess to do has just become a great deal more complicated. Tess starts checking the bodies in a panic, looking for any clues they might have left behind for where the other Fireflies might be, or another place that Ellie might be delivered to. But Joel's had about enough at this point. He tells Tess that they've done their part, and he's not going to risk his life and Tess's to finish a job that he has no patience for. But at that moment, Tess drops some terrible news on him. She tells him that while they were making their way across Boston to the Capitol building, in one of their many encounters with the infected, one of them managed to bite her. She shows Joel the wound and begs him to make sure that Ellie gets delivered to the Fireflies. Tess knows she doesn't have long now, and she admits to Joel that both of them are terrible people on account of everything they've done to survive, which is why she feels so strongly about this one last job. She tells Joel that if he feels any sort of obligation to her after years of friendship, which he clearly does, then he needs to do this for her. He needs to make sure that Ellie gets safely delivered to the Fireflies. She asks Joel to find his brother Tommy, all the way over in Jackson County. Since Tommy was once part of the Fireflies himself, Tess figures he'll probably know where to take Ellie. Just as Joel agrees, the 3 of them hear activity outside the building and realize that they've been surrounded by a military convoy, most likely the same one that hunted down the group of Fireflies. Tess tells Joel to take Ellie and run, informing him that she'll be staying behind to buy them time. And as much as he may not like it, Joel knows that it's the best option right now. The infection has been in Tess for some time now, which means she's about to turn, and she's determined not to let that happen. The military swarms into the Capitol building just as Joel and Ellie make their narrow escape, slipping past dozens of soldiers. As they flee, they hear the sound of gunfire and combat behind them as Tess makes her last stand. Heavily outnumbered as she is, she's killed quickly by the military. But her sacrifice is enough to make sure that Joel and Ellie are able to escape. And that's it for part 1. When we come back for part 2, we'll take a look at the next few months in Joel and Ellie's trek across post-apocalyptic America, and their encounters with a rotating cast of memorable characters.
And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at GamingBolt, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.